Jonathan Frost, thanks very much for joining me. Much appreciated. I'm so excited to have you today. And just to, warm our palates, why don't we get started into memory lane? Walk me through your past history, how you became a fraud security professional.
You could say it's a little bit of an unusual path that I followed. My background was really in video production and public relations, but I followed one of my bosses to a business which at the time was owned by Bill Gates, and the objectives that he'd taken on there was to do a whole load of business change. It was one of those classic situations where the business had grown really quickly by acquiring lots of different businesses, and we had to do a whole load of change across the EMEA region, and it was a big challenge. So I took that on, did that for 2 or 3 years, summoned to the Workers' Council in Germany when my employee upset someone. It was really interesting experience. And then at the end of that, was talking to a friend of mine who worked in the economic crime division of the City of London Police. And he said, if you want to change, why don't you come and work here? I basically started working on a report which was about vulnerable people and financial crime, which was paid for by our Department of Health. That was about a 6-9 month piece of work. And then I went on to work directly with victims of boiler room fraud, so people that had been duped into buying shares, and then never really looked back, just took on more and more responsibility, culminating in being the program director for our National Fraud and Cybercrime Reporting Center, which in US terms is a mix of IC3 and FTC's Consumer Sentinel in a way. And I've never looked back. I find fraud so fascinating. It really is an incredibly interesting area. And the convergence rather of fraud and cyber it's a given.
Yeah, and isn't it amazing how you managed to squeeze the whole journey, lifetime of career path into a few sentences? It's pretty remarkable. Can you pinpoint the pivotal moment? There's always some moment where because you take different paths, right? You take different forks in the road, right? Like you're supposed to pick one, but then you don't know. It's always a hindsight, like whether you realize you did the right thing. Do you remember can you pinpoint where you can say, okay, at that moment I knew I had something that I really like and I really enjoyed and I wanted to do and I wanted to continue? Or it's always just a hindsight thing where you're looking back 5 years?
I think the investigative side of it was something that definitely interested me. The technology side of it also, because effectively criminals are using technology. They use the same tools as anyone else. In fact, sometimes one of the observations I've made around people that do boiler room fraud, for instance, is that in some senses they're criminal marketeers. If you think about it, they're effectively using the same techniques, tools, customer relationship management systems, for instance, but with the intent of extracting money from people for something that isn't of value. All of those different components, I think, make it a really interesting area. The international aspect of it as well, I think, is really interesting. But when push comes to shove, I think also the psychology of it, it's really problematic when you're talking about victims and you're explaining to people what happened to victims of fraud. So often the comment is, how could they be so stupid? And the reality is that these are not stupid people, particularly in an area like boiler room fraud. They were always super well educated, doctors, solicitors, engineers, people who were arguably very intelligent, but at the same time, probably slightly life had passed them by a little bit. They really didn't understand the technology aspects of what was happening. perfect example of that is I had a guy who was an ex-telecoms engineer, and he thought he was dealing with someone who was in London because it was a London phone number. And he couldn't get his head around the idea that the call had been routed via the internet and that they were somewhere else. To him, there was a piece of wire.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Historically speaking, fraud has been around since the human evolution. And some of the most famous ones. Who was the guy who was selling the Eiffel Tower back as scraps metal?
Yeah,
stuff like that always happening. Do you remember the first couple incidents, like the ones that you start to unravel and pull on the strings and figure out where it goes? Do you remember like the first couple cases? Maybe something that comes to mind.
One of the things about the way the UK manages fraud is that we put all of the reports into an analytics system. And I don't just mean a big database, but it's got a graph component. It does entity resolution, etc. So what you would see within that system is a graphical representation of the links between the reports. Now, the reason that was important in answering your question is we could see that large volumes of calls or interactions were occurring in relation to specific phone numbers or company trading styles. And to cut a long story short, that led me to the point where I began to have a real appreciation for the impact that fraudulent call centers in India were having on the UK. And in particular, at that point in time, there were a number of scams that we were running, but one was a kind of a repayment of an insurance that was taken by banks where they shouldn't have taken it. And effectively, they were calling up consumers and doing an advance fee fraud. And the sheer scale of that became very apparent because of the analysis we were able to do. And I think at that point, I determined that about 18% of everything we were recording probably involved a call center in India, which it's an incredible number. We were recording over 2,000 tech support frauds a month.
Yeah, the scale is remarkable. And isn't it similar to like stake work, for example, for police officer, where they're sitting there like in the movies and sitting in a police car outside of potential bank heist for hours a day and nothing happens, and all of a sudden, boom. Is that something similar in kind of the fraud space where you're tapping on the wire, you're trying to figure things out, and then all of a sudden you get the information you need?
I think there definitely is a parallel there. Again, if I think back to the earlier periods when we were beginning to realize what the impact was from India, if we were to do an inquiry on the phone number, if we were to ask who the subscriber was, we quite often would get a real person, and it would be someone in India. And obviously, over time, they evolved into using false details of victims, etc., etc. A lot of that early inquiry was very significant in helping us understand the size of the problem. In some senses, I guess you could say it's a bit of a lucky break, but to your kind of analogy of someone who's under surveillance or undertaking surveillance, they know full well that at a point in time, the criminal will begin to have an appreciation for the tactics that the police are using, and they'll change their behavior accordingly. And that's effectively what we saw in relation to this problem as well.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of people that are the victims. They're not necessarily, they're just like regular individuals. They're just as smart as anybody. And a lot of it gets unreported, right? Because sometimes it's so painful, and it's demeaning to admit that you got cheated, that a lot of these do not even get reported, right? They just eat through the kind of the loss, and they just don't say anything. They don't want to say anything to their family members, to the authorities and whatnot. So the overall sheer scale of it can potentially be much larger.
There's undoubtedly a fraud for everyone. There's undoubtedly a circumstantial aspect to it as well. In relation to boiler room fraud, bereavement, retirement were big triggers. But at the same time, a friend of mine who I wouldn't consider in any sense to be vulnerable was a victim of a bank impersonation fraud. And in her circumstances in that moment, it was the eve of a big job she had with her biggest client. She was in a hotel room away from work. They just hit her, and she was feeling unwell. And they just hit her on the phone. Oh, I'm from your bank, and you need to do everything immediately because otherwise all your money's going to be gone. And that was just the right moment for her. It just tipped her over, and she ended up sending £4,000 or £5,000 as a consequence. So I think it's in no sense true that people are stupid in any way. And people undoubtedly also feel significant amounts of shame. There's no question about that as well. I had victims who would say to me, I haven't told my wife. I've lost all of this money in this boiler room fraud and I haven't told my wife. You had, on occasion, sadly, people saying they were going to take their life because they couldn't see any point. But the thing that always really struck me as well was when someone told you why they'd entered into it in the first place. So a lot of people talk about greed, and they say, what this person must have realized they weren't going to get a 20-30% return. But then you ask the person, how did you come? My daughter's got cancer and I wanted to take what money I had, increase as much as I possibly could so that she could stop work. There's nothing selfish about that. Quite the opposite. So I think this kind of people are stupid, people are greedy. It's not the case in my experience.
And I think in general, we lack, as a society, we lack the financial education. They don't teach you that in school, even university, sometimes, depending on what you're taking. So I'll give an example. For the majority of the population, a return of 20-30% sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
Right? It sounds okay. I put $100, I get $130 back every year. It sounds reasonable. But if you're a financial professional, you know that a guaranteed return is, you'll be a very rich individual if you manage to do this on a consistent basis. And it's not normal.
And also, if you look at, so share purchase fraud, these boiler rooms where they were selling penny shares, etc., that kind of evolved over time. So it evolved into things like commodities, so diamonds, gold coins, even Christmas trees. Seriously, they were selling shares of Christmas tree plantations. We had also a massive problem with.
Hey, it's the holiday season. You might as well join in.
Seasonal. We also had a massive problem with land banking. So they would take a piece of land, they would say, we're going to divide it up into 100 lots. And a big supermarket company wants to build a supermarket there. So you need to get in now. And of course, realistically, you were never going to get your money back, etc. But they were all plausible. They would launch their kind of campaign, if you like, their marketing campaign, off the back of articles about the fact that the price of gold is going up, or there's an increased demand for land, and that there's going to be X amount of building. Or a more recent one was graphene. So graphene superconductor, blah, blah, blah. Or suddenly they were selling shares in a business that was on the brink of a massive discovery in graphene, and so on. So there's always an element of relevant kind of truth in it.
And speaking of relevant, it sounds to me you can almost distill a fraudulent transaction into certain elements. You can change the labels, as you mentioned, whether it's land, whether it's gold, whether it's penny stock. Do you mind, if all possible, distilling into what are the elements of a fraudulent transaction, and potentially take that and say, tell the individuals who are listening to this, okay, if you get a sense of these elements, where you're going to get defrauded. So would you be able to do that? I know it's tough
that's not an easy one, David.
It's a very tough question. Yeah, but nobody says this is going to be easy.
Okay, I think the interesting part about all of this is that if you were a salesperson and someone said you need sales training, then someone would sit you down and say, what you need to do is you need to identify the person's needs, you need to identify the reason why they might want to buy whatever you're selling, you need to think about the objections, you need to counter the objections, and then you need to close. That's what fraudsters do. And effectively, they are also using the same techniques when it comes to the sort of funnel, if you like. So whether you're a crypto investment scheme that wants to get people that are interested in crypto investment, so you put fraudulent adverts on a tech platform that feature a celebrity, or whether you're an Indian call center that's calling people pretending to be Amazon, press 1 if you want to cancel the purchase of the iPhone, etc. These are all just creating a kind of a sales funnel, really, to all intents and purposes. Going back to my earlier comment, I would actually say that in many ways, the techniques that are used by fraudsters are absolutely akin to the legitimate sort of world of commerce, for want of a better phrase. I guess the real warning signs in any interaction with anyone about anything is urgency. Because you've got Daniel Kahneman and Thinking Fast and Slow, etc. If there's one thing that's going to increase the probability that someone's going to make an error of judgment, it's when they get into that less thoughtful space. They get into a hot state or whatever. And fraudsters, as some salespeople unfortunately do as well, some legitimate salespeople do, will always try and put you in a hot state because they want you to make that error of judgment. They want you to skip the steps where you reflect on that 30% return and, well, hold on a minute. If I put stuff in a stocks and shares account, I might make 5-10%. That's pretty good. Why suddenly can I make 30 on Christmas trees in Brooklyn or something? And so they will always try and pressure people into making a decision. And in fact, actually, one of the campaigns in the UK around fraud is called Take 5, as in whatever anyone asks you to do, and it's predominantly aimed at the customers of banks. Just take 5 minutes to think about it. Go off and ask someone else. That's the other thing. Secrecy and isolation. You can't tell anyone else about this opportunity. It's only for you. You can't discuss this with anyone else. You can't tell anyone from the bank that you're about to transfer this money. All of those, so pressure, speed, secrecy, they're all warning signs.
And to double click on another interesting component is when there's a transition. You mentioned somebody was in a transition, a hotel room, not feeling well. It can be the holiday season where you have a lot going on. It can be travel. It can be you get a phone call and you have the kids screaming in the background, or you're about to board a plane. There's just chaos, and all of a sudden you get a request, and because you're more vulnerable to agreeing or just want to get this thing off your plate, then you make the mistake. Absolutely. Right? Is that correct?
Yeah, no, it's really well put. It's that sort of almost that cognitive sort of confusion. Actually, a really good example of this, typically, again, the stereotype of a tech support fraud victim will be an older person or a senior in American terms. And I actually presented at the launch of an event that the Dutch government did on tech support fraud because they had a kind of a sort of public-private partnership. Microsoft, Google, and others, for instance, you also signed an accord to act against the issue as it pertained in the Netherlands. Now, the really smart thing the Dutch did is, to your exact point, the victim that they rolled out for the press conference was not a senior. It was a 32-year-old man who had literally, on the day he got defrauded, in a bank help desk fraud is what they call them. We call them bank impersonation. He'd come home with his newborn baby and his wife. And that person who called up, whether they knew that or not, just happened to discover that put him in, to your point, the right kind of frame of mind to make that error of judgment. And that's the principal reason why he complied with their instructions, because he was trusted.
And Jonathan, you bring up a good point. It's easy nowadays to figure it out. All you have to do is you post it on social media, or somebody else tags you, and within minutes, the whole world knows that you just had a newborn baby. So they just do 1 + 1, and you're more vulnerable. So social media is making us more vulnerable because it allows for the fraudsters to basically gather that information and utilize that in conjunction to tried and true method. So sometimes you're being targeted very specifically because of the consequences.
And actually, to that point, what are we now beginning to see, particularly in the US, is hyper-personalization of social engineering. We've had a lot of conversations within the industry about deep fakes, and people were saying, we don't really believe it's being used, we don't really see it, etc. There was a gentleman that gave some testimony to one of the US, I think a Senate committee or something like that ilk recently, about what happened to him. And he, to your point, received a deep fake communication from his child. It was a voice note, I think, from recollection. And of course, it sounded like his child. And he was a lawyer, I think, by profession. And obviously he was quite taken with this notion that his child had just been in a car wreck and blah, blah, blah. We are providing people with both the knowledge, the opportunity, and the content, unwittingly, to craft social engineering attacks which are bespoke to us, which is a pretty frightening thought.
Yeah, it is. And it's the collective of all that data is available, whether it's your audio, your video, your confidential information that is available on multiple sites and then being aggregated into one. It is super tough, almost impossible. So people, again, the people who are listening to this, you mentioned the 5-minute rule, like just wait 5 minutes. What else can we do? Because it's not just, as you mentioned, it's not just the elderly, or it can be anybody. It can be even your kids online on video gaming platform. And I know my kids have been defrauded on trying to buy some digital assets, gaming assets. And you know what? When they got hit, and Jonathan, and you know what? When they got hit, I said, great. Hopefully you learn a lesson. Oh, I might try to use lose $20 in a gaming transaction.
So
yeah, as long as it doesn't really hurt you, then you can come out of it. So they lost the $20 of assets.
Do you know what I think?
But it happens.
To your question, it really comes back to, if we not unreasonably infer that there's a cyber component in pretty much every fraud, what's in your control as an individual? Absolutely the hygiene side of things. We all know that there are lots of people in this world that are not using good passwords. They're not using 2FA, two-factor authentication, etc. They've got a 4-digit PIN on their iPhone, and it goes on. the security of devices, the security of accounts, and it doesn't have to be complicated. In fairness, if you look at Apple, a lot of people don't actually even realize they've got two-factor authentication turned on their Apple products because it's intrinsic to the operating system. It just happens. But some of the advice that I've given in the past, where people have said, I've got a parent, they can't cope with 2FA, they find it really annoying. I've said, go out and buy them a hardware key, like a FIDO compatible hardware key. Everyone knows what a key does. When you go and log on to that service and it says you need to insert your security key, there you go. It's an easy kind of way for people to have high levels of security with minimal levels of kind of complexity to all intents and purposes. But one of the fascinating situations that we have, particularly here in Europe, there was a piece of they passed various regulations, one of which was Payment Services Directive 2, catchy name. But one of the things that they said in it is that you need to have strong customer authentication for payment cards and for other online digital financial services. As a consequence of that, we're seeing increased theft of mobile phone. Why we're seeing increased theft of mobile phone? Because within strong customer authentication, one of the factors the bank can consider before it authorizes the payment or allows you to buy something online is whether or not you possess a device that's trusted. It's Christmas party season. We've seen also a mix of drink spiking and mobile phone theft. And I actually, someone that I worked with, their brother was a victim of this. Late 20s, drink was spiked. He has 4 hours where he has no recollection at all. Doesn't know what happened to him. Got home somehow. Why do I mention it? The iPhone that he had with him had a 4-digit PIN on it. They'd shoulder surfed him in the pub, in the bar, and knew with the PIN. And they then did 24 grand's worth of fraud. Personal loans at 4 a.m, point of sale with debit cards, in betting shops, you name it, they did it.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. And it's not even that sophisticated. We talked about multi-factor authentication, when the SIM swapping is a thing now where they call your telco and your service provider and ask to change the SIMs. And again, it's just common sense. Don't leave your things that it all boils down to basic hygiene and common sense and being skeptical. So don't leave your drink out in a bar. Wow. Be wary of who's behind you.
That's a physical manifestation of risk. It's true. But I think it really does come down to whether you've got friends, family, members, etc. Sit down with them and help them configure their phone so that it's secure. Buy them a 2-factor authentication key so that they can use their services. And speaking personally, my parents, there's no point in getting them to use long, complex passwords. It's just not going to happen. And although obviously password keepers are really useful, so 2-factor authentication is the best way to secure their environment because it provides them with a balance of convenience and risk management.
And it's amazing that since everything is electronic now, we went from potential a couple $100 in your pocket to get stolen at a bar because you were knocked out to, as you mentioned, tens of thousands of dollars of damages due to the fact that we're able to get your device and now start to siphon funds. So we're a creature of habit, and then we like convenience. But that convenience comes with a price. I mean, we are loading now all our credit cards into the phone. And so now, once somebody gets hold of your phone, and your PIN number, the sky's the limit in terms of what can they redraw, and basically they can clean out your entire bank account. And it's very hard to prove after the fact that it wasn't you
The
necessarily,
proof issue
because
is
right.
I agree, is a real tension. However, if we think about cards on phones and tokenization, particularly within the context of the US environment, where you still have unfortunately a lot of very out of date point of sale infrastructure for credit cards, those tokenized cards on phones actually bring consumers an awful lot of protection, because you aren't swiping a card and actually sharing the details that are on the card. You're just sharing this one-time use token. There's always give and take in all of these things in terms of whether you get some protection from it in one sphere, but then you also maybe get some additional vulnerabilities in another. Again, interestingly, on this point of strong customer authentication, the French regulator has written to all of the banks in France and said, you can't refuse to reimburse a customer just because you can point to one of the aspects of strong customer authentication. And that is knowledge, possession, and inherence, so biometrics. And they've done that because they've recognized that there are situations, to your point, in which consumers are suffering detriment and they haven't authorized the payment. I mean, I think also the US, again, is a fascinating environment from my perspective because of checks. No one here uses checks. It just doesn't happen. I can't remember the last time I had a check. I actually don't even have a checkbook, thinking about it, because the bank stops issuing them unless you insist on having one. But the situation in the DOJ put out a press release, I think, a couple of days ago, whereby consumers are receiving large amounts of small charges on their check accounts because someone was basically issuing a load of effectively electronic checks, I guess through ACH, however it works, and they were all being paid.
Yeah, and it's amazing because it's a hybrid, right? So now you can deposit a check using a mobile device. You can go to the ATM. I think the ATM scans it, and depending on the amount, you can pull that money out right away. But it's a paper. It's essentially just a paper thing, and it gets scanned digitally. But then it's been around for a long time. I know that they were just sending out stimulus checks. It wasn't done electronically. They were just mailed out. It was significant amounts of money.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, because if you modernize the infrastructure, if you, for instance, again, the US is on the brink of a revolution in payments, because the UK's had effectively real-time bank payments since 2008. And when I see the thing that's different is that in the US, you can send money in real time between people using something like Zelle, for instance, but you have to download the app, you have to link your check account, etc. Here, it's just built in to, you go into your banking app, you say, I want to send money to Dave, you put in sort code and account number, the money's gone. It arrives in less than 2 hours, and in most cases, instantly. Now, that's great from to your point around creatures of habit and convenience. The term that's often used within the banking industry is it's a low friction experience. But the problem that we've had with it is that, of course, it's now turbocharged the opportunity for criminals to disperse money through the banking system, to the point at which the company that operates this instantaneous payment system actually built an algorithm that traced the money. So you had what we would call a victim of fraud. It's called an authorized push payment fraud. Say someone was trying to buy a car, and they send £6,000 to the so-called seller of the car. This system, called the Mule Insights Tactical Solution, catchy again, would actually draw you a graph, and you could basically see the person send the £6,000 to the first mule, and then you could see it ricocheting across the banking system. And the real actually kind of irony for some of the banks was sometimes it would go from the victim to another bank, go through another kind of 3 generations, and then come back to them because they had the kind of mule at the end of the chain, if you like. The problem with technology, the problem with giving people these low friction solutions without you putting in appropriate safeguards is that you create a bit of a rod for your own back. And that's what we effectively did with real-time payments. Now, the risk for the states is that it's going to repeat that with FedNow and, you know, the modernization of ACH, etc. Watch this space.
Yeah. And what about digital currencies? We can't talk about fraud without bringing those up. And there's also a bit of a trade-off where in one aspect of it, you want the banks to be able to trace the funds so they can protect you. But on the other side, you lose all sorts of privacy ability to be private. What's the trade-off there, and how do authorities are dealing with that particular? Because I know the European Union is very big on privacy and the ability to be forgotten, the GDPR rules.
Within the context of fraud, we've seen cryptocurrency firms enter the UK market. They weren't necessarily particularly well regulated at first. Now we have regulated firms. Our Financial Conduct Authority regulates them. They were all doing the same sort of high quality know your customer checks that our regular financial institutions were doing. But they're susceptible, just like any other financial institution, to someone else's identity being used, or in the case of a lot of frauds, particularly socially engineered ones, actually duping the victim into giving their identity so that could be used on board with the cryptocurrency exchange. Interestingly enough, I can recall being in a meeting with some of our banks and representatives from the regulated crypto industry in the UK. And one of the banks said, the problem with you, pejorative notion, is that it's all anonymous. And the person, an individual from the crypto industry, quite correctly, in my opinion, said, hold on a minute. I can't look in your ledger. I can't look in the ledger of all the other banks. I can't determine who sent what from who to where, etc. Everything in our environment is open. There is an intrinsic truth in that, which is that provided who sent the money or who converted the fiat into a particular currency, crypto is highly transparent from that perspective. But it's not universally well regulated. And that causes significant problems in the sense that it is used to disperse money. Ransomware, for instance. Ransomware wouldn't exist without crypto. It couldn't be done. No one is going to send a SWIFT payment with a couple of $100,000 to get their network unlocked.
Yeah, and even meeting you in a street corner with a suitcase of cash, that's also pretty dangerous.
And actually, funny enough, you've just reminded me of another kind of anecdote around cause and effect when it comes to security. So in the States, you now have chip cards. but you have chip and signature. We have chip and PIN, which they also have in Canada. One of the consequences of this, however, was that when they wanted to fraud a consumer, they would ring them up and get them to give their PIN, but then, of course, you needed the card. So we actually ended up with a situation whereby elderly people, in particular, it was the elderly, were getting phone calls from someone claiming to be the bank saying, I need to give you a new card. And they would send someone to go and collect the card. They'd already got the PIN out of them. And then they would go off and obviously abuse the card. And to your earlier point, because you had the card and the PIN, the bank went, it must be the customer. Then, of course, the banks caught on to that. So they applied controls. 85-year-old people don't generally go to the Apple store and buy 2 MacBooks. So the returns on what we called courier fraud diminished. So the solution that the criminals came up with for that was to ring up the elderly person, tell them that they needed their help with a sort of kind of secret sting within the bank because there was corruption, etc. And they would ask the elderly person to go and buy a high value item, quite often a Rolex watch. So then we had all of these elderly people going into central London, into some of the big department stores and turning up and trying to buy 24 grand Rolex watches. After a while, the retailer was just like, yeah, this doesn't seem right. And what were they doing with those watches? They were walking out the door, going around the corner and handing it to a plainclothes policeman. But all of that came about because of the improved bank security, ironically.
Mm-hmm. That's why the Rolex seems to be doing quite well from a value perspective. I always knew there was something more to it than the Swiss movement. So before we jump into the regulation, which you already touched upon, I'd like to just maybe cover the sheer scale of what we're talking about, because I don't know if the listeners are aware of what we're talking about in terms of the revenue associated with it and the loss of revenue and what is the collective cost for all of us, because at the end of the day, this fraud increases the average transaction cost, and typically that's being offset to the consumers. So it causes everything to go up because somebody has to pay for it, and typically the consumers and companies are moving the cost downstream. So what can you just entertain me with some numbers?
In the UK, we have 2 ways of looking at the size of the problem. We have the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which is done by our Office of National Statistics. And they interview a couple of thousand people, actually just shy of 3,000 people, I think it is, on an annual basis. And they ask them, have you been a victim of various types of crime? And one of those is fraud. And that, unsurprisingly, produces a rather large number. We also have as a secondary measure things that are reported. We refer to that as police recorded crime, so things that the police have actually recorded as crime. And that, again, is all centralized. The volumes are markedly different between those 2 measures. But to cut a long story short, the current sort of estimate is that 40% of all crimes in the UK are fraud. 40%, which is quite a lot. If we look at the forthcoming regulations around banks reimbursing victims who've sent money as a result of being a victim of fraud, the estimate, the actuals, so the occasions where people have asked for money back, about 500 million a year. But that's just one payment method in a sense. If you were to look at, it's billions. Even a country of 70 million people or whatever we are right now, I think we're 68, 70, you're talking billions. And you're right, it's a fiscal drag. I think that's the economics term. It's a fiscal drag on our economy because in all likelihood that money doesn't stay in the UK. It's not used to purchase goods and services in our economy. It goes elsewhere. And the same is true of the US. Fraudulent schemes coming out of the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, etc. The significant problem you also have with fraudulent calls originating from India as well, not to mention domestic threat operators. Yeah, the impact's huge. I think one of the real challenges for the US in getting political attention on this problem is that there is no reliable overall figure for the impact on the economy or the impact on citizens because of the highly regionalized nature of your law enforcement mechanisms and the fact that reporting to someone like IC3 or Consumer Sentinel is largely voluntary and only probably occurs when people are either directed to do it or they know to do it of their own volition.
And in some countries almost sees this as a source of revenue as part of their GDP, right? So we're dealing with sometimes state-sponsored fraud, right, to finance industries.
And actually, again, that's a really, these sort of macroeconomic events that occur in regions or countries do lead to the whole China, Myanmar pig butchering scenario is a perfect example of that. They built these massive resorts for Chinese citizens to go and gamble and do whatever they wanted to do outside the PRC for various reasons, COVID and other restrictions. There was no one was going to them. So what do you do with them? You turn it into effectively a center of fraud. And that's basically what's happened with pig butchering. People have been trafficked, abused, and held in these kind of Las Vegas style Asian cities. That's pretty bizarre.
And sometimes, and sometimes the lure is too great. I saw an interview with a software engineer from the Ukraine. He said, I can make $200 a month or $300 a month having a legitimate job, and I have the skill set working in some software house, or I can make $20,000 a day helping in a ransomware scheme. It's almost, and then also the fact is digital. They sit there in some village somewhere in Eastern Europe, or whatever, and they're so far removed from the impact of, as you mentioned, some people commit suicide after they lost their life saving, but they're so far removed from it that also makes they get desynthesized in terms of what it is that they actually do. So all of these are contributors to the fact that there's a growing scale of people joining the industry on the kind of quote unquote dark side.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of a bit of a stereotype, isn't it, that criminals and fraudsters are sociopaths, and I don't think that is the case actually. And again, going back to the situation in India, for instance, you've seen loads of people that have found themselves working in those environments, and quite often, to another observation you made, those environments might well handle legitimate business. There was one that I saw some details on probably about 6 months ago, and I think in the day it was like a travel agent, and at night it was doing the scam calls. Those people that find themselves in those environments, someone recruits them, telling them they're going to be in a scam call center, and they have come forward. They've come forward and they provided information to people like the Federal Trade Commission and others. These aren't necessarily bad people. They just find themselves in bad situations.
And so let's jump into the regulation. You mentioned quite a few times that there are different initiatives from the different governments to curtail these type of activities for the benefit of all. Do you feel that there's enough to be done, or is it just from experience and just looking around? It seems like we're just too slow to react. By the time we create some sort of compliance regulation, and it takes a year or two to have that in place, and another couple of years for industry to catch up to it, there's already a brand new method. As you mentioned, the fraudsters are very agile in the sense that they see that something's working, they continue, this it's not working, they create a new method, and there's an impact. There's almost an undesirable impact, as you mentioned. All of a sudden, there's a increase in phone theft because of due to the. So, what's your thought about like how can we make this more effective, and what's your thought about like how the compliance regulation is being put in place right now?
So I think smart regulation, if you want to use that term, if someone comes to you and says, we're going to introduce ubiquitous real-time payments, as a regulator, in an ideal world, you want a regulator to think, okay, what's the upside of that? Great for the economy, great for business. People can move money around really quickly. You can pay your builder whilst he's still stood in front of your house, and he can go, oh yeah, got the money, and off he goes. But at the same time, you'd want that regulator to also be thinking, hold on a minute, what are the potential unintended consequences of this new mechanism, service, etc.? And I think that in the broadest of senses, regulators have been potentially slow or naive to think about the negative or the unintended consequences of technology, whether it be real-time payments, strong customer authentication, mobile phones being used for two-factor authentication, because the mobile networks quite reasonably go, well, hold on a minute, we never signed up for the idea that people were going to rely on a text message to let someone into an account. That was never part of our proposition. So I think my sort of kind of synopsis would be that we really need regulators to think ahead of the problem. Are we getting to a place where regulators are beginning to do that? I think to some degree. I mean, we've probably been through a cycle in the UK, for instance, around real-time payments, where I had to give a presentation recently on it to an audience in Australia. They were all from banks. And I said, one of the things I did was I went back to the reports that were going into the Bank of England about the real-time payments service, and they produced this report every 6 months. There was not one mention of fraud or the need to guard against fraud in any of those reports. It was only when consumers became so frustrated with the whole situation, and our consumer association, which is also known as Which, put in a super complaint, that the banks went, oh, actually, hold on a minute, maybe we are going to need to do a bit more here. And that's not really an ideal situation. Now, if you look at the situation in the European Union, where the Commission quite rightly wants real-time payments across the entire Euro area, cross-border, and then you look at what they're proposing by way of controls to mitigate the risk of fraud, I guess first point is they recognize there is a risk. That's a good start. But what they're proposing as the control is what we call confirmation of payee. They call IBAN name check. And what that means is when you type the name of the person into the payment screen and the details of the account, it goes off and says, yes, this is Jonathan Frost's account, and gives you a confirmation. That's not a fraud control. Because if I'm socially engineering you and I want you to send the money from France to Germany, I know that there's going to be an IBAN name check So I'm going to give you the real name of the account. And if you go to me, hold on a minute, I thought I was paying X, but you're telling me to pay Y. That's all part of keeping your money safe or hiding. That's social engineering. Do we have a way to go? 100%. Is the situation in Europe probably a little better than the US? Yes, because to be candid, we do have some regulation. Whereas I think in the US, there is a reluctance to regulate and a very strong lobby from various parts of the economy to avoid regulation. And sadly, I think that probably is to the detriment of citizens when push comes to shove.
Yeah, and yeah, we'll touch upon briefly about the lobbyist section as well. And isn't it part of the issue as well is that we're talking about fairly complicated topics right here. I mean, you're a professional, you've seen this before, but you have years of experience of understanding the mechanics of a fraudulent transaction, and it's evolving constantly. So let's say I'm a public representative, I sit in the Senate or the Parliament, and I have an assistant that does the emails for me. I'm pretty far removed from technology, and frankly, I don't understand it. Yet, I have the power to make changes and move things around in terms of where the industry's got to go. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. How do you fix that? And some of these people, I'm sure, got hit on by themselves, and that causes some sort of cascading effect. But it's very tough because the decision makers sometimes are not that savvy in terms of what this all means, and just go ahead and approve or disapprove. But frankly, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated, and being able to take a problem and understand the complexities within it, and then also project yourself into the mind of a criminal and think, how are they going to misuse this? Some of that's speculative as well. I think it's beholden on all of us effectively to be the canary in the coal mine. And whether it's the cybersecurity industry or people in fraud or people who work in money laundering, etc., to keep pushing, to keep sounding the alarm and basically saying, you need to think about the way this is going to be misused, and providing an evidence base, unfortunately, about the abuse, such that politicians can't ignore it. I've had some conversations with people in the US fairly recently, and their view was that fraud is just not a priority. And everyone dislikes the story about the grandma getting defrauded or the senior that's convinced to send the entire balance of their retirement account to some fraudster. But with the exception of, I think, probably Senator Warren, who's actually even discussing these issues, and even her sort of observations were specific to one particular problem. There seems to be an absence of public discourse around it. It's almost accepted, and the same is true here to some degree, that it's just a fact of life and people are going to lose money, and some of them will get it back and some won't, and c'est la vie. That's not good.
Or just like saying, hey, it's not going to happen to me, and if they couldn't realize it's a fraud transaction, they deserve it.
Yeah, I think arrogant.
Maybe part of natural selection.
I think arrogance is another.
Something like that.
I agree with you completely, because people, if you think about it, people are they're not very good quite often at predicting how they would respond in a particular situation. Or they make assumptions. They think, I would have done X, I would have done Y. That's not how we're fallible.
And Jonathan, we have a recency bias too. We're very squirrely. We're like, oh, what's the latest? And there's just so much going on, right? Where if you turn on the news, a grandmother being defrauded by losing her entire life saving is not even on the news.
No,
it's not even nowhere close to being the top 50. How is going to get the collective mind share from anybody?
That's a really useful observation, and sadly, I think you're entirely accurate. I will give again the UK government some credit, actually, because they have begun to talk about fraud. That they've actually labelled it as a national security issue. And if you look at all of the ancillary criminality that surrounds various types of fraud, that's a pretty reasonable thing to do, whether it be human trafficking, or I remember having a conversation once with a company that leased cars and vans to businesses. And they introduced me to the concept of a criminal taxi. I hadn't heard of it. And effectively what people do is they start a business, they build a turnover, they go to various companies, they lease vehicles, they insure them, business insurance, and then they rent them out to criminals, because what do criminals want? They want a vehicle that's properly registered, properly insured, and appears to have a legitimate purpose for moving around. And then eventually the people that were behind that business will just stop paying the lease, etc. And he said, we get these vehicles back sometimes. He said, we've found machetes under the seats. We've unfortunately found that the vehicle's covered in blood and all sorts of... So God only knows what they've been used for. But the reason I mention that is because that starts with fraud.
Yeah, and it needs, as you mentioned, it requires a village, a collective effort, including not just the public, but also private, public sector collaboration, which you had a preview because you were responsible for that at a large scale, but you also had to deal with industry as well. And what's interesting is that the adversaries, they are very good collaborating in the Telegram channels and so on. They're very good at exchanging ideas and information and methods and tactics. Yet for us in industry, it's sometimes companies are reluctant to open up the kimono in terms of what happened to them, and vice versa. So we're not as good at sharing, and that needs to change as well.
A systemic response within an ecosystem, if you like, which are some of the buzz phrases that have been used here most recently around our fraud strategy, requires data sharing. Now, interestingly enough, you mentioned GDPR earlier. Now, GDPR is not a blocker. We have a very high level of data protection law in this country and across Europe, because it's all based on the same legislation. It's not a blocker. GDPR is not a blocker when it comes to data sharing. Interestingly enough, the blocker, and I was recently, for instance, at an event, and someone I know from the Dutch Bankers Association said, we can't do that in the Netherlands. Data protection, GDPR, etc., it's not allowed. And I said, we need to stop with this. You can't do it because of GDPR thing. You can't do it in the Netherlands because your information commissioner, the government function that is responsible for interpreting the legislation, has decided that it has a different view, say, to the UK ICO. And actually what you need to do is you need to lobby your politicians to change the mind of that public authority, because fundamentally their interpretation of it is wrong. And she just smiled. She goes, I don't disagree with that. But I also don't have enough time left in my career to actually get it done. We've got to start somewhere. The long and short of it is data sharing is absolutely pivotal to the whole thing.
And it's quite incredible that a regulation that was put in place to protect the consumer, rights, is now being utilized or being interpreted to basically, at the end of the day, it's actually hurting the consumer, because the lack of sharing in that regards, in specifically to fraud, it creates a gaping hole in terms of the information sharing, the ability for organization to mitigate fraud.
I think that's a fair comment broadly. Again, in the UK, we already have a well-established tradition of exchanging information around fraud. We have an organization which is a non-profit called CIFAS, which has a national fraud database that records every ID theft that occurs. It records every occasion where someone receives money that they shouldn't have received, known as a beneficiary fraud. And it records situations where people maybe have told lies on applications for financial services products. That's pretty good. That's a great start. But the problem with our current data sharing arrangements, and this has got nothing to do with legislation, it comes back to your point around public-private partnership to some degree, is that it's not real time. A lot of it, a lot of what's recorded is after someone in a bank has done an investigation. That might take 2-3 weeks. And if we think about the kind of the velocity of people being under social engineering attack, being duped into doing X, Y, or Z, you really need to be able to understand and identify risk in real time. We are doing some other stuff in the UK, for instance, and they've already done like an initial proof of concept whereby you're a bank and the profile of your customer, their age, how much money they've got, etc. And they want to send some money to someone else. In an ideal world, you want to know something about that recipient. I'm a small, medium enterprise. I'm paying an invoice. It's $50,000. And I've told the bank I want you to send it here. And the bank then looks at the profile of that recipient account and go, hold on a minute. This is a personal account held by someone under 21 who's only ever had a turnover of $500. Am I going to send the 50,000? No. So we call that extended fraud data, basically, within the payment mechanism. We're getting there. We are seeing more real-time data sharing, but there's a lot still to be done.
And we're running out of time here, but I'd love to squeeze in a couple more questions. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I appreciate your time. To distill a culture of awareness, right? It takes, as mentioned, it takes everyone's effort. So I'll give an example. In the Air Force, I know that there is a certain time allocated to viewing like post-mortem of accidents, right? So people are aware. Can we collectively, again, just do that as individuals, maybe talk about fraud or potential fraud with our kids, with our family members? Should we spend a couple minutes maybe? And I know we have the time. We're stuck in traffic. We can listen to podcasts like this, or should we watch some YouTube videos about things that happen, or sit around a family dinner and say, hey, listen, this is what happened to this lady, or this is what happened. So just be aware, be a little more skeptical. What can we collectively do with our coworkers and employees, family members, parents, siblings, whatever the case may be, to potentially just distill some sort of awareness around potential frauds? Because I think that can make an impact. I think if people are, yes, you get more more sophisticated methods every day, and it's tough. But can we do this? Is this something we can collectively do?
I think it's an excellent question. And I'd be willing to bet that a lot of people have probably made a plan in their family, particularly if they've got children, for fire. So what happens? If there's a fire, what do we do? How do we get out? Where do we go? Etc. People who live in earthquake zones, they'll probably have a plan. They might even have a grab bag. Why should fraud or cybercrime be any different? It's been suggested, for instance, that one of the ways to mitigate the WhatsApp deepfake scenario is for people to have a family password. That's a great idea. That's pretty sensible, because to your point as well, in order for you to establish the family password, you have to discuss why it's needed. And that within it,
it's almost like a, Jonathan, just to be clear for people listening, is almost like a safe word.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
where
That only you would know. I don't know, the name of your first dog or something. It's something that you haven't put on social media, to your earlier observation, that can be used in those situations. But fundamentally, I think the point is it comes down to making a plan. What am I going to do if I get a text message from you I'm not expecting? As a matter of course, am I going to call you and validate it? And if I can't get hold of you, then I'm going to assume that maybe it's from someone else, and so on. So I think it really does come down to your point, having a discussion, making a plan. We had a famous campaign here that was all across television for many years, and it was called Clunk Click Every Trip. And it was about putting your seatbelt on. And people quite often say, oh, we should have a clunk click for fraud. There is a bit of a difference between something like a seatbelt and the consequences of not wearing it and fraud. Because the seatbelt scenario is very visceral. Everyone knows what happens to them if the vehicle stops suddenly and they haven't got a seatbelt on. They know they're going to go.
And it's very uniformal as well, Jonathan. Meaning that it's always the same. But fraud has
an ever-changing scenario. Absolutely. So I think we have to adapt to that ever-changing scenario by having a continual conversation. I talk to my parents. They're both in their 70s. I talk to them about fraud all the time, because it's the best way, to my mind, to make sure that they find themselves in an empowered situation and go, oh, actually, hold on a minute. I remember the conversation we had about X, Y, or Z, and it just alerts people to it. And then friends, neighbors, a lot of people actually find fraud quite interesting. And my parents' neighbors will always say, what's the latest thing that you've heard about? Or they'll say, I read something in the newspaper last week. Tell me more about it. So it's not necessarily like you're trying to lecture people or anything. People are actually quite interested.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that you are. It's like they say, the shoemaker walks bare feet, but it's not your case. You're somebody deals with that, but you're constantly, making sure that the people around you at least are protected. So, do you think there's going to be ever a pendulum shift where we're now? I think we're in a situation where we're very much gullible, at least maybe certain chunks of the population. Are we going to get to the point where we don't believe anything that's happening? We are like, you call your wife, your spouse, or you ask her, hey, can you wire me $10? And they say, well, you can't be serious. Is that really you? I don't believe you. We get completely to the extreme. Or where is the middle ground where we do this in networking, this whole thing about trust but verify? Where should we get to? Where's the nirvana in terms of getting fraud completely?
I think it would be reasonable to observe that for all of the problems that technology creates, it didn't create fraud. What it fundamentally has done is it's empowered criminals to do more faster, in really simple terms, whether it be messaging or any type of technology. Why do I say that? I think it would also be worth observing that actually one of the controls or one of the ways that society is set out to mitigate fraud is by using the same technology. So in a world where I think we're going to see increased use of generative AI, and in its broader sense, I'm not just talking about deep fakes, for instance, my prediction would be that we're going to see those used to attack individuals, their frailties, this sort of hyper-personalized social engineering. But we're also going to see the same technology used to automate the process of testing controls within bank channels, e-commerce environments, etc. The things that people are doing manually at the moment. What is the limit on sending a payment? If I order a TV that's $500, is it more likely to be dispatched than one that's 1,000, etc.? Now, to your question, logically, we would want to see some of the same technologies begin to provide a bit of a protective wrapper around individual consumers. Is it beyond belief or a possibility that at some point people might begin to build protective technologies into devices that maybe warn you or flag things as being potentially a fake, or that we invest more time in the authentication of interactions, whether it be a call and having confidence that it really has originated from that number. So I think there's a whole kind of, the bottom line is technology is a threat, but technology is also the solution. And I think to your observation around people, I don't think you can really train the risk out. I think you can do a lot with people's awareness, but when push comes to shove, what you really need to do is have a systematic way of trying to reduce or remove the risk.
And as you observe, the velocity of everything increased, right? The velocity of business increased. It's price to pay to have transaction in a split second, as you mentioned. Pay the builder while they're standing in your yard, and we were a creature of convenience. We like to do all of that, and then maybe that's everything comes with a same with vehicles, right? We used to take forever to travel, and now we travel at much higher speeds, but this comes with some sort of
there's a kind
trade-offs.
of intrinsic debt surrounding the use of technology in a way, to your point. But fundamentally, this is all just about risk management, and technology is actually pretty good at managing risk. If you, again, look at the statistics for our financial services sector, they stop a lot of fraud, an awful lot of fraud, but they stop it without necessarily you having to call up every other payment you make.
Yeah, we talk about the friction. Talk about in the banking
They do it
industry.
without creating huge amounts of friction, and that's to their credit. I think that one of the interesting kind of dilemmas from a kind of industry vertical perspective is that the banks have had an incentive to use technology to first initially control their losses, so unauthorized, what we would call unauthorized fraud, and then subsequently, most recently, authorized fraud too. Other sectors, such as telco and tech, haven't had the same incentives. They have the same opportunity, but they haven't had the same incentives. For instance, there was a time at which I remember having a conversation with our dominant telco, and saying to them, you really need to start blocking some of these fraudulent calls. Oh no, we could never do that. It would be a breach of regulations and we're just the pipe and blah, blah, blah. Common carrier kind of conversation. Now they're blocking a couple of 100 million calls a week or something. It's a ridiculous volume. And we've had a situation where you can no longer make a call into the United Kingdom and present a UK phone number because it's too risky and they want to protect their customers. They've even made it a part of their marketing process. It's their tagline, I think, is connecting for good. You can't connect for good if you're delivering loads of scammy calls to people. The real question mark is probably over tech. Having said that, Google work with our financial regulator and have pretty much eliminated a lot of the problems in their ad infrastructure when it came to sort of fraudulent ads for regulated organizations and impersonations and things of that ilk, in fairness to them. Other parts of the tech industry have still got some way to go. And we've got an Online Safety Act, which is going to require them to do a lot more in the ad space. And it's going to be really interesting to see how they respond to that law and whether or not it provides them with adequate internal business case, if you like, to take some of the opportunities that maybe the banks have been taking for a long time.
Yeah, and I think the industry as a whole is more mature in the tech industry as well. Look at the airline industry. This, statistically speaking, is very safe to board a plane. And I think we're going to get there eventually. It's just going to be very safe to touch technology and deal with technology and utilize technology. We're just not there yet. I think due to the speed of innovation and maybe also the overall maturity of the industry, where everybody's running around creating the latest and the greatest. We're going 100 miles an hour without seatbelts.
I really like that parallel with air travel, because you're absolutely right. And it comes down to this, doesn't it? Something dropping out of the sky and killing 200 or 300 people, that is pretty noticeable. But the reality is that 200 or 300 people probably have been defrauded in the first 2 minutes of this podcast. But they're dispersed. They're not all on one conveyance or in one place. And I think that's part of the challenge in this. It's in recognizing that actually it's just as serious, and the regulation and determination to create safety is just as important as it is in relation to air travel. It's just we need to get to the point at which people recognize that.
Absolutely, Jonathan. And I typically like to wrap up with a positive tone, but I think you already covered some of those. And you mentioned that there's definitely a movement towards fixing things. And overall, we all benefit from technology. Yes, there are some casualties and some drawbacks, and it's part of as you mentioned, the debt. I really like that. Is part of using technologies is such. But before we part ways, and I really appreciate you taking the time, if all those watching for taking the time to watch this and listen, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you?
LinkedIn's probably the best place. They can just hit me up on LinkedIn. Always happy to take a message or get a new connection. Fairly easy to find. Obviously, Jonathan Frost. There aren't that many of them. Yeah, go for it.
Fantastic. So thank you all for joining, and thanks again, Jonathan, for joining me today. Much, much appreciated. And for all of us who wants to see it in the next episode, maybe we could collectively grab some questions and people make some comments, and we'll do one more. I think we can